Professor Sheehan's superb works on James Madison, including James Madison and the Spirit of Republican Self-Government, and the mind of James Madison, have taught me so much about that great founder, and I drew on her work in writing the book that I want to talk to you about today, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. I want to tell you about why I came to write this book and to engage in a really unusual COVID-era reading project that sent me back to this ancient moral philosophy. And then I want to tell you how it changed my understanding of how to be a good person and how to be a good citizen. And then for Constitution Day, I will leave you by telling you that the biggest takeaway that I got from this reading project was rediscovering the transformative, radical power of deep reading, deep daily reading. And I want to try to inspire you to do that as well. So here's how I came to read the books of ancient philosophy that inspired the founders when they wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. I was reading the part of Ben Franklin's autobiography where he describes in his 20s his efforts to achieve moral perfection. And it's an unusual project that he started. He decided that he wanted to be a better person, so he made a list of 12 virtues that he later expanded to 13. And they included prudence, temperance, industry, silence, resolution. He saved the one he found hardest for last, and that was humility. And he made a chart, and he had the virtues on the x-axis and the days of the week on the y-axis. And every week he decided to focus on a different virtue and to put an X mark next to the virtue where he fell short. He tried this for a while. He found it was incredibly depressing because there were all these X marks. You know, every time he lost his temper, he had to X himself out on temperance, for example. But he thought he was a better person for having tried. I knew about this project because a couple of years ago, a rabbi in Washington, D.C. recommended that a friend and I try a Hebrew version of Franklin's 13 Virtues. It turned out there was a Hasidic rabbi in the 18th century who admired Franklin. He translated the Franklin Virtues into Hebrew, and this rabbi had us try them without knowing that they came from Franklin. And every night for a couple of weeks, we'd put an X mark next to the virtue we fell short. We also found it's incredibly depressing because there's so many X marks. But like Franklin, we thought we were better for having tried. What I noticed during COVID that I hadn't seen before, it was right before COVID started, was that Franklin chose as the motto for his project a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of before called the Tusculan Disputations. And the motto was, without virtue, happiness cannot be. A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia on the UVA campus. And in the room of the hotel was a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson drafted for his daughters. And they looked almost exactly like Franklin's virtues. Silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. Resolution, do what you ought and resolve to do what you resolve. Jefferson left one virtue off his list that Franklin had, and that was chastity. But what really struck me was that Jefferson also, when he was asked the meaning of happiness and to explain these virtues when he was old, would send a passage from this book by Cicero, the Tusculan Disputations. And it said, it was longer than Franklin's excerpt, but it said, he who's achieved a tranquility of soul, who's neither unduly exuberant or unusually despondent, he is the self-possessed man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man. So I thought, I've got to read this Cicero book because it was so important to both Franklin and Jefferson in their definition of happiness, not as feeling good, but as being good. Not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. But what else to read? And then I found this amazing reading list that Jefferson would send to kids who were going to law school, who asked him what they should read, to his friends who asked how to be an educated person. And it's an amazing list, both in the scope of the books he recommends and in the rigor of the reading schedule he prescribes. You've got to get up every morning before dawn, read for 2 hours, reading moral philosophy, watch the sunrise, then in the morning you can read political philosophy and law, then lunch, then some science, astronomy and the natural sciences, then dinner, then you're allowed some Shakespeare and poetry, then to bed, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, no breaks. So, and then I saw the section of moral philosophy. Sometimes Jefferson called it ethics, and sometimes it was natural religion. And at the top of the list was that Cicero book, the Tusculan Disputations, and then other books by classical Greek and Roman moral philosophers. Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, Seneca's Letters, Epictetus, and then Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, Francis Hutcheson, Lord Bolingbroke, and David Hume. What really struck me is that I'd never read any of these books. And I've had a wonderful liberal arts education, and I am so grateful every day to the incredible teachers in high school and college and law school who taught me English. I was a literature major in college, and political philosophy and history and law. And I'm grateful always for these teachers, and you are so fortunate to go to this extraordinary university and both give thanks to your teachers and appreciate the incredible opportunity you have now to read and to be caught with excitement about learning about history and philosophy and the humanities, because it's going to stay with you your whole life. It stayed with me. But nevertheless, I'd never read these books of moral philosophy because they fell out of the curriculum when I went to college in the 80s, a long time ago. And although they used to be at the center of what not only college kids, but even high school students read throughout American history, by the 1980s, they were no longer read. I remember in college, I was yearning for this kind of guidance. In the 1980s, it was the greed is good decade. You do you know, let it all hang out. I was looking for an alternative to the hedonism and materialism that were celebrated by pop culture and movies and so forth and music. I was studying Puritan theology in college. I was an English major, as I said. Puritan theology was not doing it for me. It's very rigorous in insisting that we can be saved not even by good works or faith alone, but by God's randomly given grace, which seemed very arduous. Plus, I'm Jewish, so there wasn't a natural place for me to look. And I wondered whether there was a guide to how to lead a good life by reason, reflection, rather than sheer authority. And what I didn't realize, because these great books fell out of the curriculum, is this is exactly the question that the ancient philosophers set out to answer. So it was COVID, we all had more time, something came over me, and I decided to follow Jefferson's schedule. And I still can't believe that I did this, but I got up every morning before sunrise, read for an hour or two, watched the sunrise, and I just have to share with you, there's nothing more beautiful in the world than the sunrise. It's just it's an unusual habit to get into, but once you take the time to do it, it just is, sanctifies every day, because it's such an extraordinarily beautiful thing to do. And then I found myself writing sonnets to kind of sum up the wisdom, which I know sounds incredibly weird, but then I discovered, well, first of all, a friend of mine who runs a great Shakespeare theater in San Diego had just posted a video on YouTube about how to write your own Shakespearean sonnets, and the meter is easy, you can figure it out fast, and then there's a turn in the third verse, it's called a volta. Anyway, he sort of made it easy, and I felt driven to sum up this wisdom in concise, harmonious form. And then I was so struck to learn later that all sorts of people in the founding era read this moral philosophy and wrote sonnets about it, including Alexander Hamilton, Mercy Otis Warren, Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet, the great Phyllis Wheatley, would read these classical philosophers and wrote poems of virtue. And then John Quincy Adams, as president, would wake up in the White House, read the moral philosophy, in particular the Tusculan Disputations, which is his favorite book, write sonnets, excellent ones, including about abolitionism and ending slavery, and then get up and keep his day going. So there's something about this spectacular literature that calls for distillation, and that's what I did. And I spent a year reading the books, and as I said, they changed my life. What I discovered is that for the ancients, happiness meant the pursuit of virtue, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure. And by the pursuit of virtue, they meant something particular as well. Self-improvement, character improvement, being your best self, using every moment of the day to use your powers of reason to moderate or modulate your unreasonable passions or emotions. They're getting this all from Pythagoras, who knew that in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, Pythagoras was a sage who lived on the island of Croton and divided the soul into three parts: reason in the head, passion or emotion in the heart, and desire in the stomach. And Plato, and there's this great Republic reading course, as you just heard the Ryan Center is giving, Plato popularizes this into the metaphor of the charioteer, representing reason, and he's driving two horses. One is noble and the other is appetitive, and his job is to use reason to ensure that the two horses pull in the same direction. The goal is not to be passionless or without emotion. It's to moderate our unproductive passions and emotions so we can achieve the calm tranquility that allows us to be our best self and serve others. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I had the honor of interviewing over the years, told me that her mom gave her a life lesson that she never forgot. It was overcome unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They'll distract you from your central task. Her mother told her to be a lady, by which she meant be self-possessed, be self-mastered. Use each moment of your time with calm, productive focus so you can achieve your goals and mission. And that was what Ruth Bader Ginsburg's mother learned from the ancient Stoic wisdom, which she learned in high school at the turn of the century in New York public schools. If you had to sum it up, it's really resisting immediate pleasure for your long-term interests. There was a famous test at Stanford in the 70s called the marshmallow test, and kids who are given a choice between having one marshmallow immediately at the age of 5 and 2 marshmallows if they can wait for 15 minutes, the kids who could wait for 2 marshmallows did better later in life. They did better in school, better in their jobs. They had impulse control. They could think about their long-term interests. They had the focus and self-discipline to read and engage in long-term thinking, and they were more successful. And what's so striking is that this basic lesson of the importance of impulse control and self-mastery and self-improvement is shared among the wisdom traditions. The founders and Jefferson read the Enlightenment philosophers, and the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, appears in John Locke, not in the famous second treatise, which talks about life, liberty, and property being natural rights. And people for a long time have assumed that for Jefferson, happiness was a synonym for property, because Locke talks about life, liberty, and property. But that's not right. The phrase, the pursuit of happiness, occurs not in Locke's second treatise, but in his essay concerning human understanding. And Locke defines happiness as impulse control, about resisting your immediate pleasures. And that's why Jefferson chose happiness, not property. It's a technical point about what's an unalienable right. And I remember being so focused on this in law school, and now I understand it from having read the literature. Locke and the other natural rights philosophers think we're born in the state of nature with certain natural rights from God or nature, not government. And when we form governments, we alienate or surrender to government certain rights in order to get greater security and safety of the rights we've retained. Property, obviously, is an alienable right. You have to alienate or exchange property to give it value, and you have to give government the power to enforce property rights, including contracts, to get the most out of your property. By contrast, the right to pursue happiness is unalienable because it's rooted in our rights of conscience, in our reason. And we can't surrender our reason to government or to tyrants or to anyone because it's inherent in who we are as human beings. Jefferson has this amazing phrase in the Virginia Bill on Religious Liberty where he says that the opinions of men, being dependent on evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot be controlled by other men. And that's why, even if the government tells you at gunpoint, you've got to let us tell you what to think. You can't give them that power because you can't surrender the power to control your thoughts. You can't entirely control them yourself. The initial thoughts are presented to your reasoning mind, and then through reason you can decide what to make of them. That's your exercise of judgment, but the power to think is inherent in who we are as human beings. So that's why Jefferson is just channeling natural rights theory when he says happiness and not property is not an inalienable right, and he's getting it from John Locke. But not just from John Locke. The most amazing thing about doing research now is that all the documents are online, and it just blows my mind that I was able to read all this great stuff sitting on my couch at home, and through word searches you can look for the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, and it's everywhere. It's in Locke and the Enlightenment philosophers, it's in the English translations of the Stoics, it is in the Christian theologians like Wollaston and Tillotson, the most popular preachers of their day, who were embracing the idea that faith is compatible with reason. It's in the civic republican literature by like Cato's letters that inspired the American framers. It's in the civic republican literature that comes from Florence. It's everywhere. Also, it's in the Eastern as well as the Western wisdom tradition. John Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras may have traveled to the East and read the Hindu Bhagavad Gita. But in his conversations with Jefferson when they're old, he's not sure whether a guy called Joseph Priestley has lived long enough to write his comparison of the moral philosophy of Hinduism and Christianity. And Jefferson said, good news, he lived, I'll send you the book. And Adams is so excited because he thinks this will show the similarity between Pythagoras' reason and passion distinction and the Bhagavad Gita, which says, renounce and enjoy. Renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal bliss. That's what Gandhi would like to quote. And it sounds just like the Stoic dichotomy of control. Renounce an effort to control the thoughts and actions and emotions of others. Focus on the only thing you can control, which is your own thoughts and actions and emotions. The most liberating life lesson imaginable. That's also consistent with the wisdom of the Dhammapada and the Upanishads. The Buddha says, we are what we think, life shaped by the mind. And the wisdom says that as we imagine ourselves to be, so shall we be, and we are what we imagine. Isn't it amazing that Adams is such a deep reader and is so interested in understanding the sources of the ancient wisdom that he thoughtfully sees this similarity between the Bhagavad Gita and the Greek philosophy, which was then also recognized by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who talks about the oversoul as a kind of modern understanding in the 19th century of following divine reason, and he was very much in this tradition. So it was so striking to see how pervasive the wisdom is and how it was embraced by the East and the West, and how it was so central to the founders' understanding of the pursuit of happiness. And then what the book is about, because the best way to learn about history is through stories about people, it's how did the founders actually apply this in their lives? They spent so much time as kids reading all this stuff. Did they lead virtuous lives or not? What did they make of their learning? Well, I discovered founders are human, and they were certainly full of flaws and hypocrisies and failure to live up to their ideals in many areas, especially slavery, of course, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what was so striking is how constantly they talked about their own efforts to be more perfect. They're always writing diaries, sonnets, poems, letters, beating themselves up for not being industrious enough, or not reading enough, or not following the virtues enough, and trying to be better. And that's what makes their story so compelling. So I start off, after telling Franklin's story, with the story of John and Abigail Adams. And when they're courting, what do they want to talk about? They've both been reading Pythagoras, and they decide to make a list of each other's faults, just like Pythagoras recommends. It's a really bad dating strategy, by the way, I would suggest. But they've just met, and they're reading Pythagoras' Golden Virtues, which says you have to take a daily self-accounting every day. So they make a list of each other's faults. And Abigail says, well, you're so brilliant and intellectually intimidating. Some people find you a little bit, off-putting. She's being nice. She's kind of flattering him. And Adams responds by saying, well, you should practice the piano more, you should read more, plus you're pigeon-toed. Not very gentlemanly, but she responds in good humor. I'll try to read more, I'll try to practice the piano more. As for a gentleman should never comment on a lady's posture. So they have this beautiful intellectual, romantic, and spiritual friendship, very devoted to self-improvement. They're always chastising their kids for not using their powers of reason to moderate and modulate their passions. And this is especially hard on John Quincy Adams, the future president. Abigail loves to quote the proverb, which says, "He who is slow to anger is greater than he who's mastered a village." Isn't that interesting, the connection between the Hebraic emphasis on being slow to anger and the classical virtue of temperance? But John Quincy absorbs all this and is always beating himself up, and I'll tell you about him in a bit, because he's such an inspiring capstone to the whole founding generation. Adams, the virtue that he's always working on is humility, because he's the most famously self-regarding man of his age. He's always storming at the idea that he didn't get enough credit for the revolution. He can't believe that he was on the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, but everyone gives Jefferson all the credit. And he's also jealous of Franklin, who he calls the Grand Franklin, who he believes is a louche and unreliable and disorganized and overrated. And Adams wants more of the credit himself. He has a great friendship and falling out with Mercy Otis Warren. There's so many inspiring women in this story in the founding. Mercy Otis Warren is the sister of James Otis, who wrote the Writs of Assistance speech denouncing the famous Writs of Assistance after the Townsend Acts as being unconstitutional. And Mercy becomes a great playwright, and John commissions her to write these poems about the revolution, and she satirizes the British, and she uses classical allusions, and John calls her the poetical genius of the revolution. But then they have a falling out over politics. Jefferson wins the presidential election. She's a Jeffersonian Republican, and in her 2-volume History of America, one of the first American histories ever written, she has 5 pages on Adams where she says he's vain and self-regarding, and he yearns for a monarchy. That was the standard Jeffersonian charge against the Federalists, that Adams and Hamilton yearned to resurrect a monarchy along the British Constitution. Adams storms at this. He says, "How dare you say that I'm vain? I'm not." She says, "Even your friends know that you're vain. I don't argue for a monarchy, but you praise the British Constitution." So they have a huge falling out, but then they make up. And the most relatable thing about Adams is he wears his heart on his sleeve, and he's capable of forgiving and forgetting. And Abigail sends Mercy a lock of her hair, and they reconcile. And Mercy says, "I've just got one favor I want to ask you. Some guy has taken credit for this play I wrote, The Adulator, and his name is on the title page of my play in the Boston Athenaeum. You're the only guy who knows I wrote it. Can you certify that?" And Adams says, "Absolutely, you're the only genius who could have written this play." Rides into Boston on a horse and goes into the Athenaeum and writes on the title page, "This was written by Mercy Otis Warren." You can see that in the Athenaeum today, a testament to Adams' capacity for friendship and forgiveness, and ultimately a measure of humility. That friendship is most beautifully on display in his reconciliation with Thomas Jefferson. Can you imagine our current political candidates after losing an election, especially one that almost led to civil war in 1800 and the rise of the first political parties, later reconciling and writing these incredible letters? And what do they want to talk about when they're old men? The books they've read. And they're I told you how excited Adams was to discover that this translation of the Bhagavad Gita had survived. And Jefferson, after a lifetime of reflection, has concluded that he's no longer a Stoic, but he's now an Epicurean. And by Epicurean, he doesn't mean a wanton pleasure seeker. That's a libel on Epicurus by his enemies, says Jefferson. No, Epicurus argued that we should not try to overcome pleasure entirely, as the Stoics suggest. That's unrealistic. But we should rationally contract our desires so that we can meet them. And Jefferson says, that's what I'm trying to do, and now I'm an Epicurean. It's just inspiring to see what readers they were, always learning and growing until the end of their days, and reading so deeply and so widely in novels and literature and history and philosophy and science. It just inspired me to try to read more too, because it's just amazing to see them do it. However, they were far from perfect, and that leads to the really important question: what about Jefferson and slavery, and what about the other enslavers? And how is it possible that these men who claim that all men are created equal and also that they wanted to lead virtuous lives so flamboyantly and shockingly betrayed their principles when it came to slavery? And the striking thing that I discovered from reading this through the books they read is that they didn't even try. And there's an amazing speech by Patrick Henry where he's just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech in Virginia, quoting Addison's play Cato, which invokes the classical virtues. And then Henry says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who thinks that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I will not justify it. I won't attempt to," says Henry. "It's simple avarice or greed. I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." Indeed. Inconvenience. I know it's wrong. I know it's immoral. I believe it violates the Bible and natural law, but I like the lifestyle and I just don't want to give it up. It was a moment of candor. He was speaking the truth. And that candor, and in recognizing it as avarice or greed, unlike the virtue of frugality and industry, was shared by the other enslavers of that generation. Although by the 19th century, enslavers like John Calhoun were defending slavery as a positive good and calling the Declaration of Independence a self-evident lie, neither Jefferson nor the enslavers of the first generation took that appalling step. They all recognized that slavery violated the Declaration. And Jefferson, especially at the beginning of his life, was constantly insisting that slavery should be ended in the distant future. The time horizon kept receding. He wrote a proviso that would have banned slavery in the Western territories, in the Northwest Proviso of 1784, that became the leading authority for the abolitionists in the 19th century. And yet, Jefferson's racism hardens during his life, and what was really shocking is for me to discover how virulent it was. And you can see this in his relationship with the great Phillis Wheatley, the first published black poet. He, in his notes on the state of Virginia, dismisses Wheatley's poetry as beneath contempt because he basically says black people are intellectually inferior and can't write good poetry. And then he says in Rome, slaves were white and they wrote good poetry, but Wheatley's poetry is no good. It's just shocking and was not shared by all of the other founders of that era. Here's Wheatley's story. She comes over enslaved, and then at the age of, in her teens, at 14 or so, is allowed to sit in on the lessons of her master's kids, and she reads classical poetry, and she reads about the muses, and she reads the moral philosophy, and she starts writing these amazing poems of virtue. And they're so inspiring that George Washington receives them with respect and praises her genius, and she's widely celebrated. She's so successful that the city of Boston says, how could this girl have written her own poems? And they hold an exam to prove that she wrote her own poems. And it's presided over by John Hancock, the guy who signed the Declaration in big letters. And it includes Cotton Mather and all these Boston worthies. And they examine her on classical learning. She passes with flying colors. They certify that she wrote her poems. And then she becomes an international celebrity. The Oprah of her day, according to Professor Henry Louis Gates in his great book, The Trials of Phillis Wheatley. And she goes to London and she's given the key to the city. And her brilliance is acclaimed by all except by Jefferson. So that makes his virulence of his racism all the more disappointing. And then, of course, there's his extraordinary relationship is not the right word, his sexual encounters with Sally Hemings, who in Paris, she's 14, he's 46. She's the enslaved half sister of his wife, who she greatly resembles. Jefferson's late wife, Martha, her father, John Wales, almost certainly had kids with Sally Hemings' parents, and that's why Sally Hemings is probably Martha Washington's half-sister, and she looks exactly like her, and they began their relationship in Paris. Sally Hemings agrees to come back to the US only on the condition that Jefferson free their kids on his death. And he keeps that promise. He allows 2 to escape, and on his death he frees 7 people, 2 his own kids, Easton and Beverly, and then the rest other Hemings family members. None of his rest of his enslaved population is freed, and kids have to be separated from parents, and the whole estate has to be sold to pay his crushing debts. It's a sign of his avarice and addiction to a kind of Caligula's lifestyle. The guy who exalts frugality lives not like a Periclean Greek statesman, but like a Roman emperor at Monticello, far beyond his means. The man who has opprobrium for debt of any kind and says that the earth is made in usufruct for the living and one generation can't impose debt on another, imposes these huge debts on his own family, which is why all of his property has to be sold, and he fails to live up to his ideals in the most flamboyant way. So it's a striking story. There's nothing to redeem Jefferson's conduct except that he knew that his action was immoral, that slavery violated natural law, and he, like Henry, saw it in these classical terms of his own avarice and greed. Contrast Jefferson with Washington, another enslaver from Virginia, but he becomes greater on close examination rather than smaller. And his greatness comes from his self-possession, his devotion to self-improvement, his character. He reads Seneca's letters as a kid, and his mom is always nagging him. And Ron Chernow, in his great biography, thinks that Washington's devotion to maintaining this granite imperturbability comes from the fact that his mom is always nagging him to do more. And in an effort to stop losing his temper with her, he resolves never to lose his temper with anyone. And he's only seen losing his temper on a few occasions in public. It's really striking when he does, because no one has seen it before. Once on the battlefield when someone disobeys his orders. Once when the Senate disrespects him when he goes to deliver an address in person. But his greatest moment ever is at Newburgh in 1784. The soldiers are going to rebel because they can't be paid. Congress can't raise taxes because of the Articles of Confederation, and Congress can't pay its war debt or pay the soldiers. They're going to rebel, and there could be a coup and mutiny. Washington mounts this wooden structure called the Temple of Virtue. He's just had read to the troops the play, Cato, and he reads a speech appealing for prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. He says, if you can muster the classical virtues, I'll ensure that Congress pays you. And he's going to start reading a speech, and he struggles to read it, and he takes out his reading glasses, and he says, forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind. And the soldiers weep. They've never seen him confess weakness like this before. And it's in this studied moment of self-composure that Washington has never seen greater. And that's the source of all of his authority. He comes to the Constitutional Convention, he says almost nothing, but it's the fact that he showed up and the fact that everyone knows that he's going to be the first president is what allows the Constitution to be ratified. And in his farewell address, he calls for America to overcome faction. And he's worried that by allowing ourselves to be overcome by passion rather than reason, we'll separate into these armed mobs. And the whole Constitution had been formed because of the armed mobs of Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts, with farmers mobbing the federal courthouses, and it's an effort to prevent factions, which Madison defines in the Federalist Papers as any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. That's why the Constitution is drafted. Now let me tell you about Madison and Hamilton, the Federalist Papers, and all that I learned from Professor Sheehan about Madison, which was so relevant. The Federalist Papers, read through this lens of the pursuit of happiness, is a manual for a how-to manual for public happiness. The phrase public happiness occurs throughout the letters, And remember, these are the documents that Madison and Hamilton and John Jay write to persuade people to ratify the Constitution. Federalist 1, John Jay says, this is a test of the proposition, can governments be constructed around reason and conviction, not force or violence? Can we have a society based on reason? And then Madison says, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. Amazing, isn't it? But he's read Pythagoras and he's read Aristotle, and he's convinced that face-to-face, unmediated democracy degenerates into the mob, just as, according to Aristotle, monarchies degenerate into tyranny and oligarchies into aristocracy, or aristocracies into oligarchy. So the classical theory says you can't have a democracy in a really large space because people don't know each other well enough to deliberate. Madison says that's wrong for two reasons. First, given representation, you don't need to all meet face to face, you can have representatives. And two, he says the large size of America is going to be good because mobs won't be able to organize really easily. And by the time they organize, they'll get tired and go home. You won't be able to have these small local factions as in Massachusetts. Instead, the greater variety of interests will make it harder for self-interest to rule. And in doing so, he turns Montesquieu's famous analysis of why you need a small republic for a democracy on his head. There's just one thing that Madison needs to make the whole thing work, and that's the virtue of the people. Unless people take the time to educate themselves about liberty and about candidates who are running for election, then they'll elect tyrants and demagogues like Caesar, who seduced the people of Rome into exchanging their liberties for cheap luxuries and allowed Caesar to set himself up as a dictator for life. So much turns on the self-mastery and the reading of the people, and this is where Professor Sheehan's work is so important. She discovered in her book on James Madison and the Spirit of the Republican Constitution that Madison is very influenced by French thinkers like Condorcet and the French physiocrats. Jefferson has sent with Madison, to Madison, a trunk full of books from Paris before the Constitutional Convention, which Madison, of course, reads because he always wants to read everything. And from the French physiocrats, Madison is hopeful that a new media technology, namely the broadside press, will allow complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers to be distributed in newspapers, and citizens can read them, and with the help of enlightened journalists that he calls the literati, a phrase that he gets from Condorcet, citizens will make up their own minds. They'll listen to different points of view, they'll dig in, and they will be guided by reason rather than passion. And that's why Madison, at the end of his life, is more optimistic than most of the other framers that the Republic may survive, although none of them is sure, because he thinks that citizens can educate themselves using new media technology. Okay, friends, now, and I'll wrap up and we can have a Q&A. This obviously looks very different from our new world. We're more polarized than at any time since the Civil War, according to political scientists and our own reading. And the world of Instagram and X is very different from the world of the Federalist Papers and the broadside press. And posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason. Everything is, a 30-second clip rather than a long essay. And the whole business model is enraged to engage. Instead of using your reason to moderate your anger, jealousy, and fear, we're encouraged to tweet our angriest and most partisan thoughts in order to get attention and satisfy our base of followers and get more followers. In many ways, we seem to be living in Madison's nightmare. What can you do about it? It's Constitution Day, and you're here in this great university studying all these wonderful texts and history and philosophy. And the most important thing you can do about it is to educate yourself. Do exactly what Madison and the founders thought. He believed that the whole system would collapse unless citizens, absolutely in college and beyond, took the time to read deeply, to learn about the best arguments on both sides, to converge with people of different points of view from different parts of the country, to set aside your partisan and local biases from wherever you're from, and to learn and grow, which is the definition of the pursuit of happiness. And now I'm going to come back and close with this new habit I developed of deep reading. I had fallen out of the habit of reading for stuff outside of my deadlines or whatever I had to do for work. And I read in college for classes, and I was a reader, but I got busy, was my excuse, and also distracted by these devices that I'm as addicted to as everyone else. And this drug that we carry around in our pocket is one that I'm just riveted to all the time and had stopped reading. And I suddenly realized that in addition to being a drug, this is also the most miraculous container of wisdom in human history, because all the books in the world are now free and online. It's just incredible. And friends, I went when I was a kid to what's still my favorite building in DC, and you've got to go there if you go to DC, the Thomas Jefferson building of the Library of Congress. It's so beautiful, and it has these sayings on the walls in gold with pictures of the gods and goddesses. The fountain of wisdom flows through books, and authors are the legislators of the world, and it's just incredible. And I was something like 5, and I was so full of wonder at the thought that all the books in the world were in that gorgeous building, and now they're literally on my iPhone. Either, you can get them free online or get these $2.99 Kindle editions of out-of-print editions of all the works of the world, and they're right here. All I need is the self-discipline to read them. And that's where reading about the founders was so inspiring. I mean, you see, Adams and Jefferson are old, and they're able to take the time to read all these books. And then I've got to tell you the story of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is enslaved. And the moment of his enslavement that he feels most crushed by is when his wicked master says he's got to stop his reading lessons. He can't be taught how to read. He feels like the master's trying to shackle his mind. What does he do? He goes onto the streets of Baltimore and buys reading lessons with bread. He pays boys to teach him how to read with bread, who are his age. And then he finds this golden book called the Columbian Orator, and he buys it with bread. And the book has excerpts from the classical wisdom from Cicero and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, and has this dialogue on slavery where the slave argues with his master for his freedom and is so brilliant in his arguments that he wins and that he's freed. And Douglass resolves he's going to free himself through learning and reading. And he goes on to become the greatest abolitionist of his time, and he contributes to the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and in his old age, he goes around the country giving speeches about the importance of self-reliance, self-mastery, and deep reading. So for goodness sake, if Frederick Douglass can buy those lessons on the streets of Baltimore and literally buy this book with bread, which changed his life, and I've got all these books based for free here, I can rouse myself to develop a habit of actually reading. So that's what I've done. And since this book, I can't say that I'm catching the sunrise every morning, although these days it's late. It's 6:50, so it's not too terrible. But my rule is when I wake up, I have to read for an hour or whatever before I browse. And this is really important. You can't count blogs and newspapers as reading. They're fine, and it's good to be up to date, but it's a totally different thing to browse a newspaper than to read a book. And Thomas Jefferson said, I've given up newspapers for Tacitus, and I feel much better. And you've got to just read a book. And when you do, you just learn something every day. It's so exciting. This morning was a book about Shakespeare in America, an anthology where it turns out that John Adams is writing a letter to John Quincy and worrying that a Hamilton or a Burr will come in and be demagogues like Julius Caesar. And he quotes Caesar and he says, we've got to read more Shakespeare to avoid demagogues. Whatever it is. And it doesn't matter especially what you read. I would say you need good books of wisdom, but it can be anything, literature, history or philosophy or science, but just read a book. And you can do it. And I know it's not intuitive, and none of us is reading, and it's not, we adults are all addicted to this, and you have a lot of other things. And I'm not, you have a lot of reading for class, and maybe it's too much to ask you to do a whole lot of reading outside of class. But in that case, just use the morning for some non-browsing, non-phone-based activity. Writing a sonnet was a weird but cool thing to do. Write a song, some creative work. Just tuning out for some time. And having a fixed time of day can be really helpful. I find the mornings really good, but anyway, I'm so grateful to have developed this new habit. I'm reading a lot of books, writing this new book on how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson defined all of American history, which I'm really excited about. And I am so grateful to COVID and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson for having gotten me back in the habit of deep reading. Thank you so much. We have some time, and some questions would be great. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned a lot of different French philosophers when you were going through. Which one do you think had the most impact on all the founding fathers as a whole?
Montesquieu. I know that because he's the most cited philosopher of all, not English and French. And his big idea was the separation of powers. And he's getting it from Polybius, and that's the most important principle of constitutionalism. It comes up in the 1780s when the states are drafting constitutions, and they all cite Montesquieu and John Adams, who's really influential then, and he cites Montesquieu, so I would say Montesquieu.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
A lot of times scholars will say that Cicero is kind of a second-rate philosopher, especially compared to Plato and Aristotle, but obviously very influential on the founding fathers. Our university is an Augustinian school, very influential on Augustine. What work of Cicero's, besides the Tusculan Disputes, would you recommend that our students read?
It is definitely true that the Tusculan Disputations is not a romp. It's not like fun reading, and strikingly, it's a manual on how to overcome grief. Isn't it amazing that the book that the founders thought was most relevant for the pursuit of happiness is how to overcome even tragedies like the death of a loved one? Cicero is writing it when his daughter Tullia has died. He's devastated. He goes to his Tusculan villa, and he's trying to steel himself to look at things realistically and overcome grief. The Cicero book I would recommend is the even more cited one, which is On Duties, which is the political work. And that even more clearly sums up the essence of Stoic moral philosophy. Cicero was a synthesizer who is the best Roman popularizer of thinkers like Pythagoras and Plato and others. So I would recommend On Duties. Thank you.
Would you say that the pursuit of happiness was fully attained, and do you think it's something that can be attained by citizens and students today?
Such a great question. I think by definition it can never be obtained because the quest is in the pursuit. It's always striving each day to be more perfect. And by definition, none of us will ever be perfect. Jesus, Socrates, maybe a couple of great divine sages through history, but short of that, it's not going to be us. But it's the whole, what's so exciting about it is the mindset is it's just these incremental improvements when you become a little more focused, a little more productive. When I'm boasting about getting up, sometimes I oversleep totally, or I don't do my reading, or sometimes I fail and I actually check email and so forth. But just being on the quest, being devoted to a sense where the day is well spent when you're engaging in productive, focused work rather than worrying about the future or the past or distracting yourself with blogs. Justice Ginsburg was the most focused person I ever knew. As I said, I got to know her, and I once asked her, how is it possible that you're able to be so tuned in when you're talking to people, but also so totally focused on your work that crowds could be gathering in her chambers when she was working on a letter or an opinion. She wouldn't even notice they came in because that's how focused she was. I said, how were you able to do that? And she said, I realized that if I don't tune in, I'll lose precious time for productive work. And she also said that's why she wouldn't lose her temper when guys would say all this sexist stuff to her when she was arguing her cases, when she was starting off, because she didn't want to lose her case. She didn't want to lose precious time for productive work. And then at the end of her life, I asked what she wanted to be remembered for, and she said as someone who used her talents to the best of her ability to make the world a little better. I think she also thought of it in this kind of incremental terms of just using these habits of focus, reading, mindfulness, and so forth. And that's what it is. That is the quest. We're not going to be Jesus or Socrates, but we could be a little more perfect every day. And when you look at it in those terms, it also becomes much more obtainable. You can give yourself a break for falling short and wake up, and every day is another day.
Considering the political tensions and divides that you were referencing, I'm just curious how you think the Founding Fathers would react, or perhaps like a piece of advice they would give aside from, of course, like doing reflective reading and learning from past wisdom. Like, what do you think what's a piece of advice they would say in terms of a virtue or practice or behavior or something that they would recommend to try and, heal this divide in some way?
Listen to the other side. The Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing points of view, is Justice Holmes's observation, but this is deeply Madisonian. I mean, you've got to hear out your opponents before you can make up your own mind, and that is why, or else factions will result. And then they would say, in particular, look at how past democracies fell. In addition to those trunks of books from Paris, they include a list of the ancient confederacies, both of Greece and Rome and Switzerland and Poland. And Madison takes notes about why the ancient confederacies fell, because he's trying to systematize what we can learn from history. And he generally says it's often, in the case of democracies, people giving up liberty, not caring enough about first principles, not defending it, and surrendering power to demagogues who will flatter them and give them immediate gratification in exchange for surrendering the Constitution itself. So I think they would say also, study the Constitution and the rule of law. And you don't have to, not as a lawyer, not in a technical way, but it's the only thing that holds us together. And finally, union is very important. The more perfect union. This is Hamilton and Washington, and it's always under threat. And secessionists, not only the Jeffersonians, but also the High Federalists of New England, who's threatened to secede when they don't like what Jefferson is doing. And then, of course, the Union breaks during the Civil War. It's very important to remember that this is one people, one nation, as John Marshall said, one nation, indivisible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just follow up on your answer to, you mentioned union. What would you say we're united by?
I think we're united by a devotion to the Constitution and the Declaration and the American idea. I think that the Declaration, the ideals of the Declaration, liberty, equality, and democracy, and the ideals of the Constitution, separation of powers, federalism, and the Bill of Rights, people vigorously contest what they mean, as Hamilton and Jefferson did. There's no single answer to those questions, but we're committed to the ideals themselves. And there's this amazing quotation from John Quincy Adams, 1839, the Jubilee of the Constitution. He says the Union's going to fall. We're going to have civil war unless we teach our children the principles of the Declaration. And then he quotes Deuteronomy, the Shema, and he says, take these principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, put them as frontlets between your eyes, whisper them to your children before you go to bed, make them the very principles of your political salvation. It's really intense, but that's how important it is for us to learn these principles. I do believe Americans embrace them, and if we learn them, we can keep them.
Would you say that like the declaration of the pursuit of happiness is the reason behind a lot of ills within society, and also the cause, the like reason behind slavery's existence within America?
Betrayal of the ideals of the Declaration was behind slavery, but it's just so striking that at least in the early generation, and really throughout American history, the great freedom fighters, the great black freedom fighters, the great women freedom fighters, none has tried to break up with the Declaration. They all invoked it. And there's this incredible tradition, starting with a guy called Prince Hall in 1777, a free black man who writes a public proclamation to Jefferson and says, "You're being a hypocrite, you're ignoring your own principles, live up to your own ideals. It's all in the Declaration." And then David Walker, this incredible appeal where he's just lights into Jefferson and says, "I'm trying to teach my kids about this Declaration. You're betraying it. Make it real so I can actually say that the Declaration's promises are extended." And then women at Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and later Ida B. Wells invoked the Declaration in their Declaration of Sentiments. And then it culminates with Dr. King on the Mall, and he says the Declaration was a promissory note, and now it's time to make it a reality to ensure that the arc of justice always bends upward. So it's another illustration of the fact that these ideals really do unite even the greatest and most heroic opponents of slavery, those who believe that America has betrayed his ideals, are always calling on us to live up to the ideals themselves.
Good, the last question. One more.
This is kind of tough. I mean, I don't even know how to phrase this, but it seems to me like a luxury to be able to have the kind of time that you would need for most people in this nation to delve into the kind of topics that you're suggesting people look into. Most people are just trying to make it. So, I mean, how would you suggest when you're talking to us, we're all very fortunate and might be able to find that time and resources, but like, how does this nation move forward when the vast majority of people will never hear a lecture like this or internalize that?
I believe so passionately that the transformative power of deep reading and self-education is not for the elites, it's for everyone. I mean, that's the Frederick Douglass story. We don't have time. He was enslaved, and he found the time to learn how to read and to read. Or Mercy Otis Warren, or Abe Lincoln had to borrow books. One gets spoiled in the rain, and he has to pull corn for 2 days to pay back the guy he borrowed the books from. So we have it so easy in terms of the access to books. Now, of course, it's very urgently important to have inspiring educational materials that will lead people to learn more. And you can't expect someone to want to, read Cicero off the bat. You have to spark curiosity and engage people. And that is what the National Constitution Center is doing. And now I can put in a plug for the unbelievable new Constitution 101 course that we're launching tomorrow at the Constitution Center. It's Constitution Day. Come if you can. Justice Gorsuch will be there talking about his new book. The Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and we're launching a new course with Khan Academy, which is the leading, math and science online provider. It's the first civics course they've done. It's Constitution 101, and it just blows my mind. It's with the leading liberal and conservative scholars. It'll be free it's pegged for high school kids, but it's really great for all learners, adult learners as well. It's both interesting with great videos and has questions and answers for assessment. And I hope it'll really just transform the debate. Plus, I'll stop there's more, like a Ginsu knife salesman. Check out the unbelievable interactive Constitution. You all got an important pocket Constitution, which you should take, but then go online or get the app. The NCC's Interactive Constitution brought together the leading liberal and conservative scholars in America, nominated by the Conservative Federalist Society and the Liberal American Constitution Society, to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. So you can find Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal with 1,000 words about what they agree the habeas corpus clause means, and then separate statements about what they disagree. Multiply that by 80 clauses, 160 scholars. It's just a thrill. And that and the podcasts and the classes and the primary text. And I'll end by saying it all comes down to primary text. It helps to read them out loud and take a text that you are moved to get and read them out loud with a friend, and then you'll be moved to learn about more. This is a wonderful time to learn and grow. It's so exciting to have access to all of this light and learning, and here's to lots of it in the year ahead. Thank you so much. Happy Constitution Day.